This is probably offensive to someone who likes hunting and 80s hair, but anyway.
That's my mom.
Good photographers have bad photos. This is one of my favorite sayings because you have to practice to get good. The difference is they don't show them, right? You go through, you take photos, you assess what you do, you edit them, you throw out the bad ones, and the good ones you keep. And I think that's key for doing work. Too many times people, they think that a photo, no matter how they took it, is good enough. And that's absolutely not the case. We're going to talk today about how to correctly photograph your models. I'm not going to do all of photography, right? Maybe some of you have had a photography class in the past. Great, that gives you an advantage in the process because you know a little bit more about the photographic process. But I'm going to talk today, and one of the key things I'm going to talk about is lighting and setting up. And one of the things I say here is lighting and color is key, and we're going to talk about that as a component of how we set it up. I'm going to toggle back and forth today between what I show on here as a lecture, and then I'm actually going to illustrate here by doing. This is one of the crucial things we're doing today. Usually I talk about this all from slides, and today I'm going to try and actually physically show you so you can physically see how I set a lot of that stuff up. But some of the basic things to think about, misalignment, out of focus, sloppy work. These are all bad messages to your work, and I see it all the time. I wouldn't put that up there if nobody was guilty of this. But in work, I see portfolios all the time where people are atrocious at thinking, well, I took a photo, and that's good enough. Well, it isn't. The other thing I'm going to illustrate today is how you can, crop or use the perspective of, higher quality cameras, ones with zoom, to control the viewer's attention. In other words, yeah, we're going to show today how to take full object photos, right? Look at that as a model, see it as a thing. But there's the other component of getting in and controlling our attention and using photography not as a record, but as a way of actually communicating something that's important to you. So, like the quintessential beach photo, right? Which one's better? Probably one that gets in closer to the content and shows the subject in the background. The subject relative to their background. All right, so we're going to talk through today setting up for how to do 2D and 3D. I still include 2D as an important component because sometimes when you're photographing, and Nick was mentioning a little bit about the project in second year, and my project in third year, we're going to be doing site analysis, and sometimes you put these big site models up, and sometimes they need to be treated more like 2D work than 3D work. And so I want you to just see that difference between the two of those things. Obviously, right? You have to be prepared to do it, and then go back, consider the work, and then maybe you have to go do it all over again. It sucks, but that's the deal. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit. These are the lights that you can check out as students. I'm not allowed to get them as a professor. They are only there available for you guys as students. Take advantage of it. Plus you get somebody to pay for lights that are more expensive, and the bulbs themselves on these are $25 a piece. So, just the cost of the consumables, over time, the cost of that can be problematic for students. So this is provided by the university, and they're a good thing to use. Now, they have more than one kit. If you're really getting serious about flat work photography, so let's say you have something large or something that you're trying to set up that takes up quite a bit of space, ideally you would have 4 of them. So I'm showing how the true 45-degree works, where you have 4 lights and 4 corners. And then what happens is you're looking at fall off. All lights have what's called fall off. And different components, different light fixture types do different things. But fall off is basically that gradient at the edge, right? Where light goes from most intensity to least intensity. These are lights. there's the 4 by 45 degree angle. And the idea there is that as they overlap, the light overlaps to create even illumination to your subject matter. Now in this example I just show a single rather small image, but if you have a large site model, you would want the two light sources to overlap. So I'm going to show that really quickly, and I'm not going to really totally set that up for you because it's a parallel issue, not a primary issue in what we're going to do. But in this case, let's say I'm going to photograph something on the wall, and you get one thing to remember: these things are used by lots of people, and they sometimes don't know what they're doing, and they strip out parts and pieces of them, and that's one of the cases here. So, like the top one here, I noticed that one's broken. This one, no matter how tight I get, it doesn't tighten up enough, which I'm sure if I took the time I could figure out how to fix it, but I won't waste your time right now. But what that means, because this one won't tighten, I have to be kind of careful on how I set it up. Sometimes having a roll of tape is really handy. You know, I can use things like this to keep it from spinning on the post, which I hate that I have to do, but basically I guess that's one of the things I've got to show you, like how to trick the light stand so it does what you want. But yeah, basically I'm using this to help support that light and not let it spin around. Anyway, so when I turn on the lights, you'll see these are two fairly bright lights by comparison. They may have some time on them. There's usually a replacement bulb inside. Yep. These are 25 bucks a piece. If you touch them with the oils from your hand, they'll burn out quickly, so you got to hold them in a particular, usually there's a, I should show. Usually they come wrapped, and so when you load them, you want to use the paper so your oils of your skin don't get on that bulb or else it'll pop. No one tells anyone this, and then they wonder why they burn out, and it costs them a fortune. All right, I won't dwell on that. So if I'm going to photograph, one of the things you'll notice, and again for this exercise I'll be rather straightforward, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to do a couple of things. See how I'm setting the tripod up to be the same height as the light source. Okay? That way, two things happen. I've got them perfectly in a horizontal line in comparison. So this is the difference between a four light setup and a 2 light setup. You can see I'm kind of, see that's the fall off that you see up on the edge. And by having 2 cover the source, then you'll see how then the overlap of the light provides even illumination. You can see on that black how that's set up. The next thing I do, and again, I'm going to do this rather simply. I'm going to take somebody's model here. I don't know who's to use as an example. So I'm setting that horizontal line up. That's the middle point of the photo. And then attaching it to the wall like that. I'm using this to illustrate, see how now I've got overlapping shadows. Now, this you might question has a couple of assets and liabilities. For something that has more dimension like this, I might be better off with a single light source, but see that high contrast now? By having the secondary light source, now I've got 2 competing shadows. Of course, every time I say a rule, I have to break it. But in this case, I might bring the light a little bit closer to the camera. I wouldn't normally do this, but the reason I'm doing this is because there's such a deep shadow that then that helps me modify that and make a more reasonable shadow out of it. Okay? I'm going to move this over to illustrate another point, and that is right now when I'm taking the photo, I'm off center on the center line of it. And I think that's what my next slide shows. And it's one of the techniques I use when I'm working with photographing flat work. You can literally take the camera right up to the subject. Then you look at how that camera lines up, and I can use the floor tiles. So in this case, there's a floor tile on this side and on this side. And I'm the center line of the camera is roughly in the middle or 1/3 over. So then when I bring it straight back, you will see that now I'm in line this way. If the table's in my way, but if I were to do this, I would take the camera right up and make sure that the height is centered on the object. Okay, does that make sense? This is all about perfection, folks, when you're doing 2D work. And again, I don't really want to dwell a lot on that. But bottom line is, that allows me to get a nice, good, square setup, and then I just move in and out as necessary, being aware the whole time of my own shadow. So see here, that's the shadow. So you can see the shadow of the camera here, and then you can see the shadow line of the camera here. As long as that's outside of it, and I don't get in between here, then I've got even illumination and it's not blocked. And then I can take that photo after I set it up, and I won't even, maybe I'll do it really quickly, just so that we have it as an example if we need to. The other thing to bear in mind, and in this case I'll just shoot it this way, a cable release is really nice when you're shooting like this, because even though they don't match the sun, and so you'll have longer exposures, especially if you change the aperture in a particular way. Okay, so you get XYZ axis. Okay, we're going to switch to 3D now, and talk about how now the situation differs a little bit. So now in 3D, we'll first start talking about how you set up the studio. And the first part, as you can see before you arrived, had a few of my members of the studio help me to set up a background. Now, this is not a true infinity background, but it's possible to create one here. And so we'll talk about that. And I also want to apologize. I loaned these out to a colleague, and they were nice enough to fold them up carefully, but you actually don't want to fold your backdrops up because it creates those creases. Usually I have them nicely ironed and smooth, and I roll them. And that way then you don't get those creases causing shadows. So unfortunately I just discovered that, and we'll have to modify, well, you'll have to take it with a grain of salt and understand that that's how that works. But I left this partially set up so you could see the infinity background setup, and then we're going to talk about how you set up key and fill lights. Let's talk about rolling that background first, then I'll get into the key and fill. So what I've done is that when I hung this background, I hung it just a little bit long. What that allows me to do is to create this background. Now, there's a couple of steps in doing that. This is if you have two sheets. The reason I'm setting it up this way, and it's particular, is that I want to have as wide of a backdrop as possible. That way, if you think about the perspective of your lens, right, I have to have a fairly narrow, far away setup if I want to keep that background entirely behind the subject matter. So if I'm shooting this on its profile, you draw a line from wherever that camera is to its outside, and you can see how wide it is. Now, if I wanted to do a one-sheet infinity background, I'd have to turn these vertically, and then I would only have this wide of an area to work with. So what I do when I set this up is I pull this background underneath. And then I can set over the top, and you want it to layer away from the light so you don't get shadows. This is infinitely easier if I just set this aside. Just like making a bed, folks. I know you guys never do it. Now, this is where you can do some things to try to, so you can see I threw an extra pin in. We're going to try to hold that back. What we're trying to create is that curvature down here. And with all the creases, it's not exactly easy. But that infinity background, if you set it up correctly, will roll the light, and you'll get less and less of an edge the better you do this. Okay? Now, I've got two slightly different colored black cloths that kind of affects it. I've got wrinkles and creases and so forth. But what I'm searching for is that nice roll in the background. Okay? The better you do that, the less hassle you have in Photoshop afterwards. If you don't do it perfectly, it's not the end of the world. But again, it saves you some post-production if you're just kind of careful about setting that up. That should then create a good background. Lighting is then the other component of how you work with that. And again, just take note that it's an uphill battle with the creases in it. You would typically want to have that set up nicely by ironing it or steaming it. The next thing, and this is a good point to reference this, those sheets are remnants. So I go to like a fabric store, Joann's Fabrics, in Ames is I think where I got these. But Walmart even has it, and oftentimes they sell the end of the sheet. So these are actually canvas, and you can pick them up really cheap. So every once in a while, like if you're there buying materials, go and say, hey, do you have any remnants of the, and look at canvas, because then they have a nice, and this stuff's thick, right? You can go and buy bed sheets. So you could go to like Walmart and buy a bed sheet, black bed sheet. Probably not Hello Kitty bed sheets because they look bad as a background. I gotta stop trying to be funny. But you know, gray, white, black, sometimes even a pale blue, any of those can work. So it don't have to be perfect. You don't have to do black. I find black works really well for most purposes, but it's not the only option that's out there. The key though is that you create that rolling background. You smooth it out, you get it wide, get as big a sheet as you can, as you can afford. It's good to have one in your own collection because then you don't have to worry about it getting dirty. Trust me, I've set up photo labs. The third one is now no longer available, or we'd be in there doing this class right now. But they get destroyed because other people don't care about it, they don't own it. When you own your own, you take care of it. Unfortunately, I didn't take care of mine, but you go and you wash it, you iron it. If you put plaster on it and it gets plaster dust, you know you got to clean that up, right? So that's the point of why it's worth an investment in a background. And I'll shut up about that now. Let's now talk about key and fill, because we're working with a two-light system. Now you can get really fancy, you can do multi-light systems and you can play with that. But the most simple setup, and the one easily available because of the lights that you can get, is the two-light setup. The two-light setup is called the key and the fill. Now right now, the previous example I gave you was an even light scenario, so that the light effect is absolutely flat. When you're photographing models, you don't want your model to look flat, right? And so the way to adjust that is to operate with what's called the key and the fill. So you take, and one, you might consider the key light is oftentimes like the sun. It is the highlight. And so if you're doing things, especially if you're doing a project where you're trying to be accurate to sun angles, you would take that key light and you would measure that. So let's say if that direction is north, then that's probably 10 a.m. Okay, so the north is to the model, however that would be. I know Yiki, that's not right for your model, but at any rate, you get the idea. So that's your key light. That's your sun. The other one is the fill. That's your sky. And so when you're setting up the fill light, you have to keep in mind that if it's even, that's the same amount of light. Light fall off happens at, so this, if I double the distance away, so this is 2 times as far away, it's 1/4 the amount of light is hitting that subject. Okay? So every increase,
it's the inverse square.
Yeah, it's a exponential change of light as you get further away. So again, you might think of this, again, you want to bring that sun in at a pretty accurate angle. And a lot of times I'll bring this one up, really high so that it acts much more like skylight. And then all you're really doing here is you're filling in shadows. You're keeping that contrast ratio down on that subject matter. So at that point then, if you understand key and fill, you understand the basic things that you have to manipulate in order to take the photo. So again, you can see here, I might bring the key in low, fill up high, key close, fill farther away. You can all see. There's the infinity background. So this one's done with a paper background. And those are sometimes more expensive, but see how flat they are, right? And so that's another opportunity. They're not crazy expensive, but they are more expensive. So now we can talk, so you can see some examples of that. But let's start talking about white balance, because that's the next key element, and how to set up the camera. So let's say you're happy, or happy enough, with your light setup. So the next is actually taking the photograph. We're only halfway there, folks, right? Once you get all the space set up, the model in there, oriented right, the fill, and the key lights, that's only half of the problem. The other half is actually taking the exposure and figuring out, exactly how to do that. Now you might note that I'm starting the camera off at a really low height. Why would I do that? Why did I set the camera there? Anyone care to take a guess? Why I lowered the camera all the way? Why not here? Why wouldn't I start with my camera high like I had it? That's a good theory. Yeah, I could cast a shadow, although if I'm here, I'm not casting a shadow on the subject. Why here instead of here?
Well, because you're at a lower perspective.
A lower perspective? Why? I didn't hear it clear. What did you say, James?
To place yourself kind of inside.
Place inside? Was there another comment over here?
I don't respect the person who lives there.
The eye level. So I'm imagining if I've got somebody standing here that's roughly this tall, although maybe I'm off on scale on the model, that point right there is eye level. And you enter in, you humanize your scale relationship with the model. Now, if you're doing big, like 1/16 inch scale, that might be really hard to do. But I think that's one thing that's oftentimes missed. We do the God, right? Oh, I'm God, I'm looking at the model, and here's what it looks like. Anybody can look at this. Most of your renderings probably will show that, but they won't enter in and be part of the space of the model. So that's one of the key things I do. I get down close. And then I have to deal with the problem of being down and close, right? Because that's the reality of the situation. And it allows me to really look at key things. Maybe relationships between foreground and background. And I can do that by setting it up in this way. So I'm going to see if I can find my cable first. And I'm going to hook this up and talk about setting up the photo and a couple of issues about that. Because I think that's what, once we get in past the basics of the setup, this is actually probably more interesting to you. So I think I have to. Sorry. It's got to attach. Hold on just a quick second. Come on. Let's go. Of course, this worked right before I got here. I'll relaunch it. There we go. Of course. So this, I'm just using this software because I can set it up in immediate results for you to see. So here's the first setup. Actually, I was hoping that it would look bad. I didn't really. Of course, it would look good, right? It's not supposed to be that way. But it will illustrate a few key things that I want you all to be aware of. First of all, and you need to choose when you do this, you might notice the very shallow depth of field. Do you guys notice that? What does shallow depth of field mean? It means only a certain range is actually in focus. Okay, so you can see right here the cardboard edge, sharp focus, here it's out of focus. The reason I have that shallow depth of field is I'm at f2.8. That is a very large opening. This is the worst part of photography. If you master this, you will master photography. F2, well maybe not all. Okay, I won't. But you'll master a big portion of what causes failure in people's, at least their intention. F2.8 is a large opening. A small opening is F22 or F32. Now you say a bigger number, that should be a bigger opening.
Do you want to talk about what that's an opening in?
What do you mean that's an opening? That's okay. So yeah,
sorry.
It's a lens dynamic. Let me get there.
Okay.
I'm going to come at this a little bit differently.
Okay.
I'm going to actually just show you the change and the benefit between how we make a change and what the cause and effect relationship is.
Okay.
So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go here, and I'm going to adjust that to a very small. That's the smallest f-stop. Now if I take the photo, and you'll see it pop up here, that's what I get. Now that's because I've reduced the amount of light that comes into the lens. So what before, this is a fairly big lens, you know, the opening of the lens is probably this big. So all that light's going through that big opening. When I shrink the aperture, when I go to f/22, now it's like a pinhole. And that's why when I change only the f-stop, you get f/22. And this is why photography is so frustrating for most people, is that they change the f-stop, and then the picture looks like crap, and they're like, I'll forget it, I'll just go to automatic, and then, you know, everything will look great. Well, then you don't control it. So the flip side, and this is called reciprocity. So there's a reciprocal relationship between how long it's open and how big the opening is, okay? And that's between your shutter speed and your f-stop. And so before I was at 1/40th of a second, I have made a change in probably about 11 stops. So an 11 stop change means I've got to come down probably, I'm just going to guess, that might be a little much. Let's try 4 seconds. It's probably going to be a little, maybe a little bit too overexposed. So this is a 4-second exposure. So you heard how long that was open. And now you can see the difference between the previous one. Look what's in focus here. Now I'm not very far away from the lens, so this is just a little bit fuzzy. But I'm now in focus all the way from, maybe I could argue, this piece of cardboard all the way back to, you know, looks like I'm getting some of this in focus here. As you get closer, the lens dynamic is going to affect that. But see the difference there? I mean, just in kind of simple change between this photograph and that photograph. Just take another photograph. Okay. So, yeah, I guess it did. So you can do what's called bracketing. And so right now I'm setting it up for multiple brackets within the exposure. So you can see how the wall, which is gray, is rendering white. That's because it's slightly overexposed. And you can see here, this is oftentimes the meter, and they look different depending on your camera, but you can see this orange line is basically the line between plus, which means overexposed, and minus, which is underexposed. But see, now I can start to record at least the detail on that retaining wall by adjusting that exposure. It's now coming out more gray than it did before. So, do you understand that? Does that make sense? Because that's probably the #1 thing if once we get through the lighting thing, I want you to come away with. All of you can set it on automatic, push the button, and get a pretty decent photo. Okay, because the algorithms on most of your auto cameras do a pretty good job of getting a roughly good exposure. But once you pass that, and you want to control things such as focus, such as getting detail and representing something correctly, you need to understand enough about how to set the camera up in order to get that done correctly. Yiki, where are you? Can I open I want to open up your model without breaking it. Will you come over here? I don't know if you can. Just jump over the table. I want you to open up the model just so we can talk a little bit about more complex things in terms of setting up that's why I asked her to bring her model, because I remember it easily. Can you take this wall out? Or not? Yeah. Without breaking it. You don't need to break your model. It sounds like you're breaking your model. That's not the point.
The sacrifice for education.
Okay. Good job. Well, you made it relatively able.
All right.
Well, we have it on film that I asked you to break your model.
Yeah, we have a legal.
Then when they fire me, okay, so I had her do this only because right now I'm obviously taking a photograph of, a particularity, right? And I want you to be looking at that. before I mentioned, you know, I could easily bring this camera up. I think you could all probably do that. You know, if you get the camera far away, aim it at it, you know, you're all going to be fine doing that. What the challenge is in photographing your models is when you get into more specific conditions. Now you have to ask the question, what am I trying to show? What am I trying to communicate about this building? Now I actually happen to know in Yiki's that she was talking about laying on the floor. I'm not going to do that. Well, wait a minute, maybe I will. How would you do that? You guys all have these. If I want to get a photograph of what it's like to lay on the floor, this is probably your best instrument.
Mm-hmm.
This is not going to be able to lay on the floor like your cell phone can. So you might think I'm a snob because I use this stuff, but I think these cameras are really useful for model scale because you can actually enter in and take photographs within the model. And I want you all to be thinking about doing that because you can illustrate something about space. I'm not going to show you that part as part of my lesson today, but I am going to look at, you know, some of the things about how to set up the model. I'm going to change the height of the camera. Only because I want to get into the scene of it a little bit more. So I can do some manipulation of, you know, the tripod to get to that scene. The next thing I'm going to talk about, though, in this particular setup, is an issue of focal length. So I'm going to start with this photo. Well, actually, no, I'm going to change this. I'll start with this. Now, what I'm doing when I set this up is I'm using currently, this is a zoom lens. And on this lens, you know, not all lenses have that capability, but I remember Nick saying that you guys might use a macro lens. So a lot of lenses have that ability to focus very closely. And when you're getting into model photography, when I'm back here, all your lenses can handle it. But a macro lens allows you to really closely focus. Now I'm going to take a quick photo. And that's, this one is a wide lens. And so you can see here, you know, this includes, and I've done very quick. What I might do now is when I look at the photo, maybe make some adjustments, you know, how are the shadow lines hitting, what are they reflecting off of, and so forth. But just for the purposes of a quick comparison, I will take another photo at another focal length. Hopefully my head wasn't in that photo too long. So when I bring up the other photo, that is exact. I did not move the camera. And so, so that's the same, that's just a 70 millimeter setting versus a 24 millimeter setting. And so what they illustrate and the difference between the two is crucial. This is much more telephoto, right? It compresses the space. And it's very, and you probably saw this photo, that's not too bad a photo, and it isn't. But the difference is key, and that is when you use more telephoto, it compresses, it feels more like you're in the space, versus here, you're still looking at the space. Is that clear, at least in how you see the image? Do you see that difference? That's the difference of the focal length. And so they throw a lot of numbers at you in photography, but that's basically zoomed wide and zoomed somewhat telephoto, okay? And that's that range between 24 and 70. If you can, and again, I throw rules of thumb at you, and that never seems to be always the case, but if you can, when at all possible, if you photograph at 50 millimeter, the key thing about 50 millimeter is that 50 millimeter is almost equivalent to the human cone of vision. Okay, so your iPhone, it's got a wonky, like I think it's a
Oh, it's crazy.
like a 2.5 millimeter, but there's a conversion because of the size of its capture area. But the long story short is that oftentimes it's distorting the view field, and so it will never look natural. That is actually relatively close to the natural perspective of human perception. So if you base off of that, you know, if you back away and go wider, so that's that 50 millimeter here, you'll know the difference between looking close and looking far away.
So would you say, Cameron, like if your eye was where the lens is, that's what you would see? Like if you stuck your head like right there, and if you stood further away at 50 millimeter, that would be what you'd see.
The scale does not matter when it's about cone of vision. Cone of vision is the same whether it's at the scale of this model or at the scale.
And this is actually why in programs like Rhino, the default camera is actually 50 millimeter. This is exactly why it is. So remember this for later.
Yeah. James, you have a question?
If you were to put a number for millimeters of human perception, what would you estimate that to be?
Well, to be very accurate, I think it's 44.5. But you know, for the
close
50
enough.
is close enough. Is that what you're? Maybe is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but the range. I mean, you know, it's not necessarily perceptibly different from 40 probably up to 60. You know, you could probably argue that they're pretty close.
But that's a good rule of thumb though.
Yeah.
Like that.
But you know, once you blow through, and again, all these numbers come from a long history that's relative to 35 millimeter film, and so everything gets converted. So like I was saying about your iPhone, you know, there's a conversion for the millimeters to its normal. That's not normal. 50 millimeter would be probably pretty darn telephoto on an iPhone. Okay, and so that's why they always say equivalent. The other thing is cone of vision, right? And so they'll do a degree cone of vision. And that might be a way to think about it. And I think there's a conversion in Rhino.
Yeah, Rhino will do field of vision.
Yep. FOV, field of vision.
Yeah.
You know, all those are equivalents.
But these numbers that you're getting, like for f-stop, for millimeters, they all have equivalents that are digital, so it's important to understand. And they're based on the physical camera.
Right. And so you can see again, and you know, and I can use this. It's probably worthy of saying again. If I want to call my attention to the person, you know, if I'm illustrating now a point, I'm in my portfolio and I'm saying this dude laying on the ground is like, you know, the whole point of the design of this model, which I happen to know in the use case that is. You know, I might come up here, set the camera, find the focus, there we go, and use that to direct my attention by, instead of doing it at f22, coming back up here at a very shallow depth of field, guessing on my exposure there. And you can see now the difference when I use a shallow depth of field. Now when I write in my portfolio as I'm describing this, or I'm at a review, and I say, this person's laying there seeing the vertical experience. That just directed my attention, versus the last image that, you know, it says everything, and everything's really nice here, but it doesn't point me to it. And I want you guys all to start crafting that in your communication. That's much more than just the whole thing. There's particularities, and you're trying to direct our attention to those. All right, I want to talk a little bit, I mean, I can probably talk about this infinitely, right? Because I really dig this subject. But I'm sure how was my time?
It's 2.
It's 2. Yeah. How long did you want me to spend? Did you have a preference?
No, just whatever.
I could probably talk infinitely. So I want to touch on, since I mentioned this, a couple things about cropping and color control.
Yeah, white balance. Yeah.
White balance.
Yeah. That'd be great.
So I'm using Capture One, which is a particular piece of software. Am I burning anyone? I'm probably burning your retina right now. Let's take a break on the lights.
Yeah, there's going to be a little hot spot in the video where it is, but it's okay.
I'm using this software. This is probably now a good time to talk about how we convert files and how we work with them. First and foremost, when you're photographing, photograph in RAW. RAW is and there's a proprietary format. You'll see these are called NEF, that's Nikon Extended Format. Canon has C2V or something like that. Canon has their RAW format. It doesn't matter, it's still the raw image data. The reason you want to do this and not shoot in JPEG, even though you can get like 13,000 photos on your card if you shoot it in JPEG, and here you only get 500 shots.
Only,
right? Is that you get the full color spectrum information in that file. And you get some ability, some capacity, it's not infinite, but you have the capacity to adjust exposure in post-production. So I'm going to choose, yeah, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, maybe this one, just because we got quite a bit of material in here. You can see right now, if I just judge this, and the projector is making this look a little bit orange than my screen. Well, let's pretend for a moment that it's, you know, you're not happy with the color of it. There's a couple of things, and this is universal. So when you bring it into Photoshop, as you convert your Canon file, or your Nikon file, or your Sony file, or whatever your proprietary format, in that conversion of the raw photo, you will always see Kelvin and tint. And that is the two fields you see here. Right now, it's actually adjusted a little too much. So this is what's called color temperature. And to describe color temperature is probably going to take me too long. But the reason color temperature came up, if you imagine it like this, is that if you were to heat up a piece of steel, okay, so it's the piece of steel here, and you put a really hot flame underneath it. As you start to heat it, what color does it turn first? I mean, I know black, but okay. After you start to apply heat, what color does it turn?
Red.
Red, a really deep crimson red. As you continue to heat it, it goes to what's called white hot. You've heard that before. What happens if you continue to heat it? It goes blue. It gets so hot it turns blue, okay? That's how they came up with color temperature, because that was the only kind of universal standard that they could use at the time of developing color. And so that's what color temperature comes from. And so these lights are slightly yellowish orange. And so that's why if I have a low, if I go to a low, this would be like candle, because candle's really, really red, okay? And when you add this blue, then it makes it look white. So as I add the color temperature, and I happen to know that these lights are 3400K lights. So I get close, and a lot of times that's nominal. The other thing I can use is, and Photoshop has this too, where you can use a color picker. And so if I'm trying to be really accurate to make that color neutralized, I can use the color picker, and that's called a gray tone, sometimes they call it white, but that, if you click on that, again, Photoshop has that very same tool in the process, you can get a really accurate Kelvin temperature. Now, I said these lights are 3400, they've probably been burning quite a few hours, and so they'll actually drop their color temperature. But the other thing is that this is probably a little bit of what's called warm color tone to the chipboard. So all that combines to mean that maybe you want to set that back a little bit, okay, from the kind of what's correct to the lights to what's correct for the model. Other thing that's happening is the light's bouncing off this warm, and that's up here illuminating it. So these are all factors. Color is very, very subjective. And just because there's rules of thumb doesn't mean that necessarily you want to adjust it. The other thing, or adjust it based on the rule, but based on the perception. So color balance here is really crucial. If I'm out photographing in daylight, that's 5400 degrees. That's what this would look like if I had it set at daylight, color temperature, and if I was outside photographing. So that's why you need to understand that difference. So interior lights, you know, you're going to have that as a photograph using fluorescent lights, which you should never do. Then I would use tint to adjust for the green tone, the green hue of fluorescent lights. Now the key is, some of you might be shooting with LED. So LED has another color temperature that's totally different than outdoor light, and not like incandescent lights, and not like fluorescent lights. Oftentimes it's more blue. So you will have a lower color temperature, and then there's a tint adjustment as well. Okay. So basically, if you think about it as an XY axis, you know, color temperature in this direction, tint in this direction, and then the Z-axis would be exposure range or depth, you know, darkness and lightness. Okay, those are your three axes of color, and that's what you manipulate. So if I get into more of the exposure now, so this is where I can come in, and if I'm within a stop of above and below, I can manipulate the exposure. I'm pretty happy with the exposure, but I kind of think that I need some more detail in the shadow and I need some more detail in the highlight. This is called high dynamic range, and because you're working with the raw file, you can, I mean, you know, rocket science here, but you know, I can pull some more detail out of the shadow, and I can pull some more detail out of the highlight. If I were to do that very same thing, let's say I wanted to see this with a better exposure, but I wasn't doing that with high dynamic range, just with exposure, you can see that as I open that exposure up, you can see what's happening over here. I'm losing all detail on that highlight. So it's really crucial how you go through the second phase. So first phase, setting up the space. Second phase, getting a good exposure and, you know, good field of view, depth of field, all of those things. And then the third phase now is how you process that photo. And this is crucial. 100 decisions are made every second in the process of manipulating this image. You know, so it comes from exposure to how you bring out. Now, I'm pretty happy with the highlight, but I might just, you know, use that shadow to pull out some detail. That's partially because I didn't light it perfectly, right? Maybe a good way for me would have been to put a light straight over the top so I get a good even illumination. But since I didn't have that, since my highlight was here, causing a lot of shadow from this plane on the building, meant that I needed to bring out that detail in the shadow. Cool? Is that making sense to you all? The only other thing, and you know, this was to a point earlier, I'm using I don't know, this is probably not the best way to illustrate this, but you know, Photoshop, any of them you can crop, and you can come in and you could change that field of view in a different way. And because of the resolution of most of your cameras, you can get away with cropping in post-production as well. So just because your camera may not have a lens that can get in as tight as you'd like, doesn't mean it's not going to work, because of the level of resolution you can come in and you could adjust that view. And so really all I'm illustrating here is, do take the time to really look at and say, okay, what's important in this view? And maybe I want to collapse that and only show a component or a portion of that particular view. And that's in the cropping side of things, and I'll leave it at that. Let me go back because I want to talk a little bit about a few things that maybe I don't need to spend your time setting up. Just talk about white balance. Look at the difference between the cardboard on the left and on the right. And the one on the left, by the way, was what the camera automatically set it at. So don't expect auto to do the work for you. But I will say this, if you're shooting raw, and if you take nothing else from me today other than that, shoot in raw. As long as you shoot in raw, it doesn't matter the white balance, because you have the entire spectrum of color information on that file. And whatever the camera does automatically, it can do, because you can adjust that through post-production.
There are apps you can get for iPhone that'll shoot an equivalent of RAW, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it actually comes with HDR, which is sort of like that, but yeah.
But you don't get the information in the same way. Like it does the processing kind of for you. But there are some manual apps that you can get that'll simulate f-stop, that'll simulate focal range, and that'll generate a RAW format if you just have your phone.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't know.
That's something that one of my friends showed me. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. A lot of times I would say, for most of you want to use.
Yeah, these are better cameras than your phone.
Use the cameras you can check out, because you don't. I think that's still tricking it. I'm not sure if it's actually using the raw data. I don't know enough about it to answer that, so I won't try. You know, I mentioned controlling fill and key. The other thing, and I mentioned about perspective, but you know, and I discussed the issue of low versus high. But you know, just we are oftentimes thinking about photographing the object. And just look at the difference between a middle level, how you can see down into that might be important, versus a low level, seeing up to it, and then looking at a particularity of a detail and highlighting that. Those are other points that I think are really crucial. As you change the light, and I think this illustrates another point, and you might have noticed in the photograph, because I'm close, because of how I'm setting my exposure, none of you noticed that the backdrop was bad, right? And that's because of the light levels. The lights are focused on this. We're not getting in a lot of light there, and I don't know that I showed a lot of the background, but I think that's key. You can see here, just by a little bit of manipulation of the light, this one I'm getting a lot of illumination. What people call, I've had people not believe me, but you can literally take a black background and almost have it light gray by how you illuminate it. You can also have a white background record as almost black, just by how you manipulate those lights. So you can see the difference in just moving the lights a little bit on how much illumination is actually hitting that background. So I know our subject matter is most important, but how you're hitting that background with light is really key as well. Yeah, watch all that so it stays out. I'm going to go through this really fast, but I want you to be constantly thinking about, so this is just some models I photographed in the past, and I can discuss a few things about some techniques I used. Here, a lot of times I use a really low light, and I look at that figure-ground relationship, right? So if I have a flat light, if the light's right next to my camera, it's like a flash, and it's really flat light. But if I pull that light off the camera, then I highlight an edge, and I can really see, the setup. I look at reflections. So this face is really being recorded as a different plane because of how it's reflecting the light. Worm's eye versus bird's eye, right? Here I'm low. I'm looking as I go up into the space. Bird's eye, I look down, I can see more of the floor plan. Even though I talk about the problem of being God perspective, but sometimes that's important to illustrate the point of your model. Talk about depth of field, I won't dwell on that. How do you illuminate it to illustrate a concept? So there are a number of factors. A lot of you get into fancy materials when you're building your models. How do you handle transparency? And so sometimes you want that light to kind of come through. You might purposefully let a portion of the model go dark, and I did that here to try to highlight the reflection in the transparent materials. Here it's an all steel model, right? And so how do you reflect? Sometimes I use a surface that's reflecting the light. Here it's a strong backlight. Unfortunately, you can see the table there, but that backlight catches edges and highlights them and separates the model from the background. Oops. Got ahead of myself. Oh, shoot. I hate it. So the backlight here, so this is a white plaster cast model, and you can see where it's almost recorded as black because I've got it strongly backlit. And what I'm doing is lighting the space in between rather than the subject at the front. And that it causes a figure-ground relationship, so you separate one plane from another. Sometimes you have low contrast images. And in this one, sort of like this dangerous animal as a model. And so, I thought in this case, photographing it more mysteriously was of value. And so I really was clipping with a single light in high contrast and then keeping that kind of exposure dark. I mean, that was purposeful and trying to illustrate a point of it, to let it kind of loom in the image. And here's another plaster, but just here you can see, and one thing I like people to think about, when you're illustrating something in a model, that you actually create a space. So here the shadow of this is being recorded on the subsequent piece. So think about how you set those models up. Again, sometimes it doesn't make sense to have really great fill light and fill it all the way in. Sometimes you want that high contrast. And so this one really shows the shadow and the repetition in that model. Just how you deal with shadows is crucial. So, here's the difference of just turning on a fill and not having a fill. So the difference between having it or not is really important. Section models, just how you look at them, right? Not all of you cut sections, but sometimes it's really valuable. That's it. I mean, I've got some other stuff here, like, you know, remember that your camera meter sees the world as gray, so it doesn't know what you're photographing. It's not that smart. Maybe someday it'll be smarter with their algorithms, but right now it's just trying to simplify to an average exposure. So if you want that model to look black, you have to force it to do that. ISO, just a rule of thumb, ISO, you don't want to crank that up, even though that means, remember when my 4-second exposure? Well, that's the pain in the butt to wait for a 4-second exposure, except when you crank up your ISO, all your images get really noisy and they get, it's like you photographed them through sand. So ISO 200 is a really common setting, and it's one of my recommendations. As you go higher, yeah, it's going to get faster, but it's going to cause you some problems. Most of your cameras have it set at auto, and so you're not in control of this. If you're not in control of this, you'll lose image quality, because when you're shooting on a black background, the camera's going to say, okay, it's dark setting, crank up the ISO, because they just want to get a good photo, and you will lose that control. You don't need to worry about the shutter speed, though, if you're on a tripod. I highly recommend that you photograph using a tripod. Not only because it reduces camera shake and so forth, but it makes you slow down and think and set up and to do that. And don't forget, aperture is key for controlling focus and depth of field. Right? That's how you, that 2.8 versus 22. That is where you really want to manipulate. Shutter speed is irrelevant because you're on a tripod and your model's not running away, right? I can't think of any time that shutter speed is going to be a problem unless, you know, like you have a model train set in your photo or something like that. Have I covered all the topics?
Yeah, I think
you wanted me to
that's
cover?
great. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think